Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Happy Tuesday morning to you. We are delighted to have you all with us this morning. We are going to have a fabulous time. This first morning session is going to be wonderful. So we want to get everyone settled in here, and then we will get started. Of course, Bishop will introduce our special guest today. And so we're really looking forward to today's sessions. So good morning to you all as you come in. Great to see you this morning. You feel free to check in on the chat. Let us know that you're here so we can greet each other. That would be wonderful. I'll start us off there. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Pastor Charles. Great to see you this morning. Good morning, good morning. Pastor Kevin, you are up early. You are in the Washington State. Great to see you this morning. We'll get everyone settled here and then we'll get started in just a moment. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. Hi, Diane. Good morning to you. I would like to mention that Dr. Dale Coulter, who is our speaker tonight, is actually on with us this morning. He's going to be listening in. So, Dr. Coulter, we're looking forward to your session tonight, and we're glad that you're able to join us for some of these today. It's going to be very rich.
Thank you, Misty. It's great to be here again at the Issachar conference with you and with Bishop. I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be wonderful. Good morning to you in San Antonio, Texas. That's a great place to be from. Good morning, Renee. Welcome. We give it just another moment as we have people coming in because we want to make sure we have all the time that we need for this session this morning. Hi, Helen. Good morning. Good morning, Lisa. Welcome, welcome. We've still got people coming in, so we'll give it just one more moment, and then I am going to turn it over to Dr. Chironna to get us started this morning. Just want to get as many people in as we can. As a reminder, we are recording, so if you're not available for every single session or the entirety of the session, you will not miss anything because you will receive a full replay of the conference with permanent access. So it's 10:05. I will continue to monitor those that need to be let into our session. And Bishop, you can go ahead and make your opening comments and introduce our guests. That would be wonderful.
All right. And Pastor Missy, I just want to make sure that you're controlling the mutes, right? So that only Dr. Bud and I can be unmuted.
That's correct.
So there's no background noise. So I'm going to invite Dr. Bud to unmute as I introduce him. Friends, I am deeply impacted by the work of Carl Jung, as I shared last night. From as early as 1979 or 1980, Carl Jung has been a conversation partner in my thinking through his writings. And my introduction to Jungian thought came as a result of a number of dreams I was having that were profoundly instinctual and archetypal, and I'll let Dr. Bud talk about that a bit. But over the years, as I've worked through issues in my own life, I have been profoundly shaped by Jungian thought. As you know, I went through a profoundly dark season from 2007 to about 2011. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It was towards the end of that season that I discovered Dr. Bud Harris. Now, I know of 16 books he's written because I have 16 in my library. He may have more, and if he does, I need him to let me know so that I don't miss anything. But post my dark season, Dr. Bud has, without him knowing it, has been a conversation partner, because I found that it's taken me years to process what I went through in that 3.5 year dark season. Coming out of it was where the relief from the pain was the initial recovery. But, at 68, about to be 69, I still reflect back on that. And summer vacations for the last 7 years, I've spent them in the workout room and in free time when my wife wanted to do other things with Dr. Bud Harris. And so I reached out to him on a fly to see if he'd be willing. I probably wrote my life story in the first email and probably scared him to death. But he was lovingly, caringly, kindly enough to say that he'd be willing to do this. And so he's written about spiritual awakening, about the integration of spirituality and psychology. He's really a well-rounded Jungian therapist. But Dr. Bud, we're glad you're here. Thank you for spending the time with us. You've got to unmute, Doc. Just if you notice up, there you go.
There I go. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm very moved by your response to my work and to myself. It's been an interesting journey for me, and I tried to bring that journey into my books, kind of a theme at a time, which grounds me and helps me take the next step.
When one of the most fascinating things to me that I'd like to start with as we interact together is that you didn't start out you ended up in Zurich. It's on my bucket list to visit Zurich. I want to see the house that Jung built in Bollingen. But you ended up in Zurich, but you were a business person. How does a business person end up a depth psychologist?
Well, it's an interesting journey, and it reminds me that I once read a book by the theologian Miguel de Unamuno, The Tragic Sense of Life. And at the end of that book, he offers us a blessing and says, "May God deny you peace and give you glory." And as I look back on that, that's what the story of my life turned into. I had, as I've told you before, a rough childhood. My mother died when I was young. I didn't live at home after I was 14. I didn't have a bad life. I went to a private school, but it was a lonely life. Went to university, met a lovely young woman, got married. I went to Georgia Tech, majored in management. And I came out of that armored and determined to be successful and wanting to achieve the life that I thought had been taken away from me early on. And so the next 10, 15 years, I worked in business, had 3 children, had a lovely wife, and at age 28, she had a schizophrenic breakdown. And I didn't know what in the world that was. I'd never seen anything like that, never experienced it. And it caused us eventually to begin to go to therapy, where we went to extensive therapy. I looked into the psychiatric system. I saw the way they treated patients back then. I didn't feel like I could really send someone I loved into that. So we worked with it ourselves with good therapists for a number of years. And I began to change during all that time. I began to think about things I'd never thought about. I began to feel things I'd never felt. I encountered life that was beyond what I could understand. And it became a struggle. And that led me into what I just described as Unamuno's blessing. May God deny you peace and give you glory, because certainly peace was denied. And as that journey continued, I began to change. The first change I made was to go into business for myself. The second change I made was to decide I have to try to understand this better. And I went back to school to study psychology. And as I was going through psychology, intensive therapy with my wife, the years went by, the family went by, and uh, things changed and shifted. And my therapist became interested in Jung, and through that, I became interested in Jung. And once I graduated, I became a psychologist. I had a private practice, and I decided my journey has got to keep going. And that's when I decided to go on to Zurich. And I did. And I lived in there for 5.5 years, training to become an analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute.
Talk a little bit when we had our conversation. Let me preface what I'm about to ask you. In the popular Christian world, which many of the people that are on this morning, they're very familiar with the popular Christian world, which they are having to work through the contradictions that are there. There's a lot of denial about suffering. You had made a statement when we talked privately about the tragic sense of life, and the book, The Tragic Sense of Life. And how do we, as people helpers, pastors, leaders, help people shift from the notion of everything's going to be fine if you just confess the right scriptures and use magical thinking, to the fact that spirituality really involves a certain amount of coping with suffering and pain? How do we make that paradigm shift? I mean, you did, when you say a lot of life passed, obviously you had to cope with a lot of different things. How do we navigate those waters?
Well, to begin with, as a 14-year-old boy, his family had been through the suffering of a dying mother. I was estranged from the church. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and we're talking the 40s and 50s now, so things were a lot different back then. And I felt like that God had betrayed me and my family, and I had a huge amount of anger. And that took me in and out of the struggle with religion until I went to Zurich, when the analyst who was interviewing me for my admission to the institute there made the comment that anybody that's as mad at God as you are is going to be in for a lifetime of spiritual struggle and development. So it was impossible for me to be an agnostic. It was impossible for me to be an atheist. I had to come to grips with myself and God, and I've never been able to get out of that. And it reminds me that Jung said in the opening introduction to his autobiography that for his entire life, his ideas had circled around God like the planets around the sun. I can identify with that, and I can certainly felt I got too close and got burnt a few times. But the important part to realize to me is that for me personally, I'm not a theologian, so I'm just talking from my personal experience and my experience as an analyst. The Christian story, the story of Jesus, is a story of love and suffering. And it tells us that life is suffering. The central metaphor of Christianity for me is a divine man on a cross. And what the whole story means to me is that God sees problems in the world, and he sent his son to teach us how to deal with them and what to do about them. And that involves carrying our own cross. And we have deluded ourselves, and we're taking the easy way out when we think we're supposed to live happily ever after. And the meaning and the purpose and the love, to me, comes from being able to understand what Miguel de Unamuno said, that may God deny you peace and give you glory. And if you can accept that, you then have the peace that passes understanding.
Well, that sounds like good theology to me.
Okay.
It may be psychological, but it sounds like good
But
theology.
I lived with suffering for decades with my wife there. My children live with suffering. And what are we going to do with that suffering? Are we going to turn to God? Are we going to find meaning? Are we going to find purpose? Are we going to identify with the suffering of Christ? Are we going to look deeper in ourselves to find the love and support that essentially is intrinsic in all of us, but in the culture we live in is very, very hard to find because consumerism teaches us to have a different kind of religion.
I'm going to go back 3 or 4 years to a season when I was once again revisiting my pain from my dark season, processing it. And having read your book, The Radical Power of Healing in Illness, if I've got the time. Yeah, I'm on an elliptical in a hotel working out, and you begin to transparently talk about an issue with your daughter that just, I mean, I literally stopped working out because of what you were sharing. I had to just stop and deeply listen. Are you willing to talk about that a little bit? Because I think it touches on what we've talked about so far, but it was profound to me in terms of what you struggled with, what the family struggled with, and what you came to terms with. If you would, that would be great.
I wrote that book for my daughter. Early in this century, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She has progressive multiple sclerosis. And I had to go through an intense struggle to accept that, to find meaning in that, to be able to stand with her and witness that, comfort that, try to be there for her while my heart was breaking myself. And she also turned to God in that, and she has had a very deep Christian journey as a result of that. And I think that has been a path that meant a lot to her. I don't remember exactly what you're talking about in the book. The whole book was for that purpose, though.
Yeah, you introduce the fact that your daughter was almost an Olympic trained athlete.
Yes.
And then, I mean, so it's a success story that I mean literally changes overnight. And then you end up talking about just what you learned. I think again in the popular world, the notion of finding meaning in illness and in suffering runs antithetical against, if we believe God, we'll get through this and he'll heal us and it'll all be over. And there are just so many profound insights in the book. Just go ahead and go wherever you want to go with that.
Well, there are two parts to that. She was a great athlete, and this illness started, and she approached the illness with the same courage that she had approached her life before that. And she started a bicycling team, Team Marge at Large. And while she could still ride, they raised over $500,000 for the MS Society.
Wow.
And that was how she began to find meaning in that. And that was an inspiration to me as well. And I couldn't believe. And during that time, of course, if you remember in the book, I had a bout with cancer
You had
myself.
about, yes.
And what I did in approaching that, I began to have active imagination with the cancer. That's a process in Jungian psychology where we actually dialogue with our illness and we ask it what it's asking of us, what it wants from us, how it wants us to change our life. So we're assuming that everything has a purpose in God's world, and that includes illness. And the idea is not that we're supposed to live happily ever after. We're supposed to find purpose and meaning. And we're supposed to bring benefits into ourselves, into the world. We're meant to find and develop deeper parts of ourselves psychologically and spiritually, and to live those. And we don't have to go out and preach them. We just have to live them, and then we'll have an effect.
Profound. For the sake of those that don't know what active imagination is. Talk a little bit about the process. And again, here I want to frame this because, you know, there is this immediate jump into, well, that's demonic, that has nothing to do with Jesus, when I have myself exercised my own heart and mind in active imagination for a long time. It's been profoundly helpful. Dr. Eugene Taylor was my doctoral chair in psychology. He was the world's leading expert on William James. And as I recall, in 1909 at Clark University, James and Jung met, and they had a lot of commonalities in terms of mystical experience, visions,
Yes.
as well as what Jung called the religious function of the psyche. So for
Yes.
me, there was a lot of commonality. And so I was profoundly influenced by all of that. I understand the process of active imagination. I do think it's a valuable tool. Eugene Taylor said we can never get to the core issues in our consciousness and expand our consciousness without dialoguing with those parts of our consciousness that we're having pain with. And so it's a dialogue, but go ahead and talk about active imagination from your perspective to help everybody.
Well, I think there are two things we have to look at there. To begin with, Sigmund Freud gave the unconscious an unfortunate interpretation of holding everything that's bad in us when he developed his theory. Dr. Jung takes an entirely different approach. He doesn't think that everything in the unconscious is bad. In fact, he thinks very little in the unconscious is bad. A lot of our best potentials are there. We have repressed a lot of our best attributes. We've repressed our spiritual potentials. There's a whole lot in the unconscious that can add to our life, that can deepen our life, that can expand our personality. And we call our personality, in psychology, our ego. That's only about 1/5 of who we are. So we need to get in there and learn more and more about ourselves. And active imagination, in this case, was where I sat down and I wrote a dialogue with my cancer. I asked it questions and listened and let it answer me. That's not demonic. That's trying to know a part of myself that I don't know easily.
Yeah, the deep heart.
And I asked two questions to it. I asked, what's troubling you and how can I help? Now, you might, if you're familiar with the quest for the Holy Grail, those were the two questions Parsifal had to ask the Grail. And those are the questions that help me know the inner parts of myself better. Now, I have to say, everything inside of me is not good. There's some things that I have to cultivate, I have to cherish. There are other things I might need to be conscious of so I can put in jail somewhere in there. But I need to be conscious of them so I'm not acting them out unconsciously.
Okay, so
I
this
need to be conscious of my aggression
yeah.
so that when I am aggressive, I will use it for good reason and I will not just end up being passive aggressive.
Talk a little bit about passive aggressive in that regard. Just explore that a little bit.
Well, I grew up in a culture, the white middle class Presbyterian culture where we taught that being aggressive is bad and that we're supposed to be good. And in fact, no, aggression is like anything else. We need to be strong at times. We need to be fierce at times. We need to be fierce with ourselves. We need to be fierce with the world at times. And the great psychoanalyst Rollo May said that it takes rage to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
It takes rage to break the boundaries we're encapsulated in so that we can then be creative.
When you engaged that deeper part of yourself, it reminds me of when Jung was young in his memories, dreams, and reflections. I know you know this. But he has this cave that he likes to visit, and there's a large rock in the cave, and he sits on that rock, and somehow he gets the insight that the rock is a self in him, and that he who is sitting on the rock is another part of the self, that there are two selves. So I'm assuming that that's the genesis of his understanding of ego consciousness and then the deeper self with a capital S. Is that a correct assumption? And if it is, or if you can expound on that in light of what you said about your journey, that would be great.
Well, I think it is. And also remember that he was the son and grandson of ministers. So, God was always something that was in his life. And when he thought of the deeper self, uh, he ended up talking about that in psychology as our greater self, that is the central part of who we are. But when he talked in religious terms, he talked of that as being the image of God within us. So that he did think there was divine energy in us, but he didn't talk about that in his scientific writing. The greater self has the program, you might say, for the potential for who we can be. And a lot of our life journey is to seek the consciousness of that program so that we can live it more fully. And to get rid of the things that interfere with that, the way that we've been conditioned to see life, the way we've been conditioned to have to adapt to life, all of those things.
Okay, so in active imagination, so for example, when you're writing down your conversation with your illness, with the cancer, and you ask those two questions, is there a sense in which part of that conversation and response is divinely being influenced at the level of your deeper self? Is there a sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because to dialogue with your cancer is very scary. I was
Right.
terrified of
Oh,
doing
I'm
it. It
sure.
took me a long time to be able to do it because I had a feeling that what it was going to tell me was things about changing my life that were going to be pretty dramatic. Do I think that's divinely inspired? Yes, I certainly do. I also think we have to be a little careful, though. We have to use discernment with what we accept and what we live and how we refine that.
Okay, so and all of that's going on, and you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the discernment process, because clearly your insights are stellar. I mean, having read the book, and the way you come to terms with all of that, talk about first and foremost, like, because we're creatures of time, there was the time it took for you to process all that, but then talk about all the changes that went on internally as a result of those two questions and how that dialogue grew you.
The dialogue grew in the way my life had grown before. It happened in a way that made me begin to question how I was living, begin to look for what wanted to be expressed in me that wasn't being expressed, and how I needed to change my life to release the energy that had built up and caused me to become ill. And I don't mean to say that that we can avoid illness. I don't mean that, but illness can bring meaning to us always. That was a struggle that went on for a year or two at least, and it was enlightening. And it caused me to change the way I was approaching my creativity, that I consider my vocation being an analyst, being one-to-one with people. And I had to broaden that uh, vocational aspect into lecturing and writing more than I had been doing.
Wow.
So I had to shift the way that my life energy was being spent.
Wow.
And that's an ongoing journey. I think that's the way our life should be always. I think we should always be evolving and questioning ourselves and listening for things that are telling us that we're getting stuck in the status quo.
Okay, so like right now, we've got in this present moment where, because in some sense you're talking about the path of individuation. So
Yes.
in for the people that are leaning in right now, because I know you've got their attention, in their own current reality, what are some of the practices that they need to begin to employ on that path to spiritual growth and maturity by way of individuation. And then maybe define individuation as you see it based on all your years of work in Jungian therapy.
Oh, you've asked me a lot of questions there.
Yeah, it's 2 or 3 in there. Just go with it.
I'm going to start with the process that I think,
Okay.
and I think most of the people listening know that the process begins with reflection. We have to take the time to be with ourselves, to be with the spirit world. And I mean that in the higher sense. And we need to reflect on our life. And what that means to me is 2 things. I have to be actively engaged in life, or I don't have anything to reflect on. And then I have to look at how life has affected me, how I am feeling, what my responses are, what's happening to me. And then I have to take a step further. I journal those kind of things. I keep a daily journal, and those things go in my journal. And then I have to listen to how my unconscious is responding. That means I write down my dreams. I listen to my dreams. I let them speak to me. I don't try to kill them with over-interpreting them, but I want them to speak to me. I want to hear their moods, their challenges. I want to see the images that are coming up in them that I need to pay attention to in my own psychological life. And those things come together, I think, that puts us on the path of individuation. The path of individuation is the path of becoming an individual, which doesn't mean individualistic. It means becoming a person, if you use Carl Rogers' term, that is unique and is freeing himself as much as possible from the influences of the culture that dominate our life without us realizing it. And we get to know the growing parts of ourselves. We get to become aware of the persona, the face we show the world. We get to become aware of our shadow side that we need to cultivate and learn more about. Those are the parts of ourselves that we have denied and repressed in order to adapt and grow up. We need to learn to be more in touch with the masculine and feminine sides of ourselves, because they are the ones that really connect us to our deepest self. And it's an ongoing journey, and we're going up and down the spiral staircase. A lot of times we feel like we get 2 steps up and 3 steps backwards. And I had a friend that says that's the way I feel, and that's generally because I'm going in the wrong direction to start with. And go ahead.
Yeah, no. So keep going, because I was going to ask you a really practical question in the middle of all that. I have had stops and starts with journaling and writing all that stuff down.
Yes.
So what is there a right way to journal and a wrong way to journal?
No, you have to
Okay.
find your way to journal, and it's okay to have starts and stops. I have starts and stops, and a lot of times it's because my energy is going to the outer world for particular things, or it's going into the inner world in a different way. The other thing I do is I keep several journals. I have a journal for my daily experiences. I have a journal for ideas for writing. And I
Wow.
have what Jung called a darkness journal, where that's the one where I really express my grief and my anger without censoring it. And I
Wow.
want to get it out of me, and I want to get it on paper, because there I can relate to it more objectively and it doesn't possess me as much.
When I went through my dark season, the therapist had me write out all my dark thoughts. And
Yes.
that was actually quite painful. What it reminds me of, this is related. Years ago, when I began to discover, when you talked about how the shadow, unlike Freud, is not just dark things, but positive, affirming things that just go undeveloped or unnoticed, that stay buried. When I first became aware of Jung's concept of the shadow, I was actually quite fearful of confronting the shadow. And I think it was William Miller, Your Golden Shadow. It was like synchronously that book shows up in my life, and I began to change my awareness of how shadow work is done. I mean, David in the Psalm says, "Thou hast searched me and known me. Thou hast known my down sittings and my uprisings," at the beginning of Psalm 139. But at the end, he says, "Search me and know me. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me." And in many ways, I've reconciled that to facing the shadow. How then do you, like, if you have a journal for your creative side, and is your first encounter with the shadow a negative and then the positive comes? Is the dark part overshadowing the deeper, more affirming aspects? Do you still have to go through the dark part of it first, or is it in stages? Is that a fair question?
That is a fair question, and we have to look at the dark part of it first, probably. And I'll give you a brief example of someone who dreamed they were being chased by a mafia figure.
Must have been my uncle.
It could have been. I'm married to an Italian, so I'm familiar with that. But anyway, what do you do with that figure? It scared him. He said, "Is this really a part of me?" And so we did an active imagination. He began to ask that figure who he was, what was troubling him, how could he help? And as that figure began to transform with the attention and consciousness being given to him, and he began to discover that that was his own capacity for strength and aggression that he had been repressing all these years to be a pleaser, so to speak. So a lot of times these figures are very paradoxical.
Wow. Wow. My goodness. There's almost, I mean, quite honestly, Doc, there's almost a mystical aspect to self-awareness when you talk about it that way.
Of course.
Don't you
Don't you
think
think we all have a mystical capacity?
Yeah, go ahead and talk about that, because I think, what shocked me over the years as a Pentecostal, who's, Joel's prophecy for Pentecostals, we go to young men will dream dreams, old men will see visions, your sons and daughters will prophesy. So all of this mystical experience, and yet a lot of what goes on in the contemporary Pentecostal charismatic world is just fluff. Jung had profound dreams, visions, and moments of mystical consciousness that were deeply, penetratingly insightful. What are we missing? I mean, I know you're not a Pentecostal, but as you look at the popular church and what's going on, what are we missing that we maybe need to say, well, how can an adept psychological approach to all this help us?
We are missing the mystical in everyday churches, as far as I can tell. And what I mean by that, we're missing the journey of the mystics, which parallels the journey of individuation very much, almost step by step. And I write in my book, The Search for Self and the Search for God, I give the parallels for that. But we miss the journey of knowing God and overemphasize belief, in my opinion.
Talk about that.
Jung was very much into the journey of knowing God, and he felt like belief would not sustain us sufficiently over the long haul. And at the end of his life, when he was interviewed in a BBC interview, they asked him if he believed in God. And he said, no, I know. And if we follow individuation, or if we follow the mystic's journey in the liturgical traditions, we begin to get a sense of God and to know God. Not that we can define God, but we know the presence. And we know that there's something really there that's acting in our life and that is available to us.
Okay, so what's the relationship between believing and knowing and Jung's profound exploration of the ego and consciousness?
Jung's profound exploration of the ego and consciousness made the development of consciousness the primary purpose and goal of his life. And as we develop consciousness, we expand the ego to know the parts of ourselves that are unknown and to stand in awe in front of the mystery of what life is and of what our interior life is. I'm sure you're familiar with the saying, the beginning of wisdom is the awe of the Lord, or the awe of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And awe means to stand there with reverence, with fear, and with wonder. And Jung learned to stand that way, both in terms of looking at his interior life and in looking at the outer life as well. And we have to grow in consciousness to know that our ego is not the center of our being. It is not the center of our life. It's the center of how we relate to life. And we need to expand that to come in contact with all of these other areas. And that's no easy journey. We have to heal a lot of our early wounds to do that because they stand in the way, they block us. We have to develop the potentials within ourselves that free us to have the greater experiences. And what I think many of the mainstream churches miss is that baptism is supposed to be the first step on a journey, not the arrival point.
Wow. This brings to mind a little step further for me because, Terry Eagleton, the essayist, he argues from a cultural perspective that the most difficult word in the English language to define is consciousness. And
Yes.
yet, when you read Ion, Jung's Ion, his work
Yes.
on ego and consciousness is profound. And so talk a little bit about how Jung sees the ego as a mirror, and yet how it's always there from the beginning as a given, and it's always constant, so that I think it's Murray Stein who says that, at the time when Murray wrote his map of the soul, he talked about how there was a lot of this exploration of the child within. And I'm thinking
Yes.
back now to what was going on in the 80s with figures like John and Paula Sanford in the Pentecostal world, and the inner healing movement, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who were trying to heal the child within. Well, when Stein reads Jung about the ego being a mirror and consciousness, he's saying that child within is constant through the whole. So talk a little bit about that reflective part of the ego and how we learn to work with that and become aware of that.
Well, there are two approaches that we take to it. And the first approach is the reductive approach. And that would have to do with healing the wounded child within. Which does need to happen for many of us. It needed to happen for me. I was deeply wounded during my childhood. And that is a first step in developing an ego that's strong enough to then be synthetic and progressive enough to begin to take in all of the other aspects that we need to confront in the shadow and the masculine and feminine side of ourself, and eventually to be able to relate to the self and understand that I am not the master in my own house. That is a big sacrifice to understand that there's something bigger in me that's running my life than my ego. And so we have those two aspects, the reductive and the synthetic or the progressive approach. And I think Murray probably talked about that in the same book. A lot of work went into healing the inner child because so many addictions were coming out of that particular kind of woundedness. And they're still coming out of that woundedness. We haven't healed the inner child in this culture by a long shot. We're wounding it more and more. And we have failed to realize as a culture that the first school of love in our life is our family. And we're not protecting families in the way that they can be stress-free enough to have a good enough sense of love for their children to make them feel safe and secure in the world. Our families are very stressed. They undergo a lot of tension. Even in middle class, upper middle class families, they're worried about money and jobs and things. And in this culture, the culture is abusive. But there is an eternal child within us too. And that eternal child means there is an eternal potential in us as long as we're alive. And I'm reminded of that when I read something like Norman O. Brown, who wrote his books on healing cancer. And as he was dying of cancer, he was refusing his pain medication so he could finish his book.
Wow.
That child in him was still coming into being.
Wow. Pastor Misty's uncle Rick died at 42 years old. He was a dear friend. He battled pancreatic cancer. In the last year or so of his life, he was pressed to put an album together of original songs, and
Yes.
it consumed him. And I mean, it was probably the magnus opum of all his writing in music from the whole of his life. When you talk about the healing of the child, because I remember those days, there was such an emphasis on it, and yet in theology, whether it's ancient Eastern theology from the patristics, which speaks of ancestral sin, or Augustinian terminology, original sin, Jung, the two basic complexes at the core would be the mother complex and the father complex, if I read him correctly. You can correct me. But would it be safe to say that regardless of how perfect or how perceived perfect we were raised, that all of us enter into adolescence with wounds and relationships to mothers and fathers, and that those are primary wounds that all of us need to address in the individuation process?
I would say yes and no to that both.
Okay.
We strive to have good enough fathers and mothers so that we can go into adolescence with a basic sense of confidence in ourselves and confidence in our ability to deal with the world. That doesn't mean we're not scared in adolescence. We're all scared in adolescence because it's such a time of change. But if we have good enough mothers and fathers in the psychological sense, we come out of that experience feeling secure in ourselves and able to trust and handle the world, or at least trust ourselves to handle the world. If we don't, if we have abusive situations or tragic situations, we come out of that with an attitude that the world is a dangerous place and we have to always have a defensive attitude toward it. And healing the inner child helps us heal that.
And how do we approach that?
We approach that through taking the long journey, the inner journey, the journey that I outline in my books, the journey that we take in analysis, the journey that many people take in spirituality and spiritual direction or in psychotherapy. But we have to heal the mother wound in ourselves. We have to heal the ability to love ourselves. And then we have to feel the father wound, and that is the ability to be able to live with strength, purpose.
Yeah, you wrote a whole book on the father wound. It's brilliant. So let's just say for the pastors that are on, they preach every Sunday to their congregation. The question was asked me last night because I did an introduction to theosis as the Christian process of sanctification that leads to partaking of the divine nature and individuation. I did an introduction to all of this. But the question was asked, and I honestly said I couldn't answer it How come we're not hearing more about the woundedness that needs to be healed? Now, that's part of, I think the current culture wants to be distracted from all of that. But for the pastors that are on, Dr. Budd, how do we most of them, are not going to be psychoanalysts, and yet what's available to them needs to be such that they can learn how to take what men like you and women in the profession have done. How do we begin to share these things and integrate them into our messages and the process of spiritual formation? Where do we start? So, and I guess maybe what I'm saying is, do we start with ourselves?
Yes, we do start with ourselves, but we also have to keep in mind that ourselves and the society are always interacting and shaping each other.
Okay.
And I look at this as an analyst, and Jung did the same thing. He asked himself, what myth am I living? And then he asked, what myth is my culture living? When we ask, what myth am I living? I'm asking, what is the structure of values that direct my life, and I think will give me purpose and meaning or happiness or whatever the goal of that myth is. And we live in a culture now whose primary myth is consumerism that drives the economy, and it keeps people working forever, and we never get satisfaction because we always have to buy more. And you can just look at diet books over the last 30 years. There's probably been, God only knows how many thousands of them. And it's not the question of how do we get healthy, it's the questions that we have to keep selling things in order to keep our economy moving. And as consumers, we expect to be able to buy something that gives us satisfaction. And we end up never getting enough of what we don't really need, so to speak. I think the important thing for pastors, if I had my desire, is to start really teaching the basic Christian values that can give us a new myth to live by based on that structure. And, the whole structure is in Matthew 25.
Talk about that.
Uh, I heard Andrew Young say not too long ago in a speech. Andrew Young, worked with Dr. King and was the ambassador to the United Nations, that as mayor of Atlanta, he had to remember that when he faced his final judgment, he was going to be asked, did you clothe the naked? Did you feed the hungry? Did you welcome the stranger? And all of those questions. And to focus on those questions is a beginning of a new value structure that is counter-consumerism. And Dr. Young took the step that we have to first question those. How do we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, help the widow within ourselves?
Right.
And once we begin to face that problem or that issue, we then gain the strength and the humility to deal with that in the outer world that will be effective. And we begin to have the meekness and the humility that's called for earlier in that chapter. And we come to the realization that the love of materialism and money is very destructive to us. And I think that really explains a lot about what it means to me to confront my shadow. I'm confronting those ignored, disenfranchised parts of myself. And that takes me into the world in a different way, but that teaches me a different myth to live by. And I found it originally in psychology, but Jung ties it right back to Christianity as well.
Profound. I'd like you to expound a little more on myth, precisely because the term myth in the current culture has become the notion of fictitious, when for Jung, myth is tied to the archetypal. I was profoundly impacted by the fact that Jung was engrossed in Goethe's Faust. First, obviously, because of his great-grandfather and the supposed sense in which his great-grandfather was the illegitimate son of Goethe. And second, that the myth of the Faustian story related to his own, he related that to his own explorations of the psyche. Talk about that a little bit and why myth is so important.
I think Jung and most mythologists understand myth as connecting us not with falsehoods, but with eternal realities. C.S. Lewis said the same thing. And eternal realities are the archetypal structure of our psyche. So when we see a myth, it's showing us something that's fundamental about human nature in story form.
Powerful. So when in our culture, we have this fever-pitched need to see the Avengers, the X-Men, Wonder Woman, Superman, the Justice League. What's going on with all of that from a perspective of depth psychology?
From my perspective, I think it's showing the culture's desperate need to find the hero within themselves.
Wow.
Or the heroine within themselves. And we have lost that.
And in some ways, why would Jung's fascination with Faust be a profoundly insightful myth for us?
I think it was profoundly insightful because it shows the nature of Faust, of being that both destroys and creates. Takes us down into the realm of the deep unconscious, which Goethe referred to as the mothers. Has a professor in there that achieved everything that we're supposed to achieve to have a good life and lost it all. And I think the story for him was a profound comment on the life that we were evolving into.
From one of the most impactful moments for me in my life in relationship to that myth was somewhere in 1994 or 95. I was going through another existential crisis. I've had many. I've had more existential crisis than normal life, I think. But I was dealing with the issue of affirmation, and I was working through wounds that I was carrying in relationship to my father. And Dr. Conrad Bars, a medical doctor and psychiatrist who wrote about what he called deprivation neurosis. Were you familiar with Dr. Bars?
I'm not, no.
And he wrote a book called Healing the Unaffirmed, Born, and he did a lay version called Born Only Once. But he goes to that moment in Faust, where Faust is sitting at his desk, and all of a sudden this dark figure appears, and it's Mephistopheles, it's the devil.
Yes.
And Faust asks him who you are, and Mephistopheles says, I am the spirit who denies.
Yes.
So that there's this sense in which that dark figure negates everything that would be valuable in us. How do we deal? And that's a very compelling force for many of us to overcome. How, from apart from a theological perspective, how do we confront the spirit that denies when it's so easy for us to believe the negative about ourselves and agree with that sense of this can't be me? How do we work through that to get to the other side where that becomes a non-issue and we actually release our creativity or our potential? How do we face that and deal with that?
I would look at it a little differently from the way you're describing it.
Okay.
I would say when he negates everything, he is negating everything that is conventionally valuable. Conventionally valuable, valued by success in the society. I would say it's, if you look at The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, what is the last temptation of Christ? It's to become a successful middle-class person. And if we look at the death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, that's a man who achieves everything that the culture thinks is the good life and dies screaming in pain because at some level he's realized he missed the whole thing. And I think that's what we're trying to see. That's what Mephistopheles is teaching us, that we have to question the conventional values that we're brought up to value. And that was true for me even in the church, because the church that I grew up in primarily valued the middle class values of the culture.
Wow.
Am I making sense with that?
Oh yeah, you are. This is profound. It's raising more questions for me about how we reconcile dealing with the accuser of the brethren. So, but that's a whole separate conversation. What I think might be really good right now, because I guarantee you've got everybody right now just processing for themselves. So maybe if in the chat, if you have a question for Dr. Budd, form the question, put it in the chat, and I'll have Pastor Misty field them, and we'll present them to Dr. Budd. I'll give you a moment to do that.
Okay, and the chat is open, so you can place that question in there as soon as you have it.
And then, yeah. And while you're all doing that, Dr. Dale, if you want to ask Dr. Budd some questions, feel free to jump in as well. You can unmute yourself, Dr. Dale, if you want to do that.
Okay, thanks. Give me a few minutes though. I'll let some other people jump in here first.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't have a question, but just a comment that this has been so incredible.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very, very insightful and very helpful and very easy to understand. Just wonderful.
Thank you.
I told Bishop I probably need about 20 sessions, so that'll be a separate email that I'll send you. Maybe you can help me.
I appreciate what you're saying very much. Jungians are
it's
not
wonderful.
famous for being easy to understand.
It's been extremely easy to follow, and it's really been very helpful. Very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like, while the others are formulating the question, Bishop touched on it, of course, as we are pastors on staff in a church and we deal with people with illness. I found the part when you talked about asking the disease, cancer, the questions to be really, really insightful. I personally have never heard of that before. And I just found that to be really a shift, particularly in church, because we tend to go right into God's going to do it. We're going to get this. It's okay. And we don't want to do anything that is going to face what's happening. It's almost like we use it in church as a way to avoid what is really happening rather than get in touch with where we are in the moment. And I just thought that that was really, really insightful and very helpful for us as people to not avoid where we are, rather embrace it and see what is really going on. So I don't really have a question on it. That's just something that I felt is very helpful.
I can respond to that a little bit. I think it's very important for us to face it, to seek to embrace it as part of what it means to be human, and to understand how that can increase our humanity, how that can increase our spirituality, how we're being called on to respond to it in a way that we could have never imagined.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, I've run across people who would rather die of cancer than sacrifice their positive thinking.
Mhm.
And that's very sad to me.
Mhm. Uh, can you talk about, um, I've got two questions here, and I want to present them in the way they were presented. So I'm just going to say that please feel free to answer them, and I know that you will. And Bishop, if you want to add to this as well. Lucy said, in dialoguing with the spirit who denies, I have gotten very angry at it and speaking out against it. What are your thoughts on this manner of addressing it? So basically speaking back to that when we encounter that denies.
Well, I certainly do that in my own dialogues. I respond with what I consider integrity, and a lot of times I'm mad.
Mm-hmm.
And but I also listen to it. I don't cut it off with anger.
Okay.
Yeah, there's always what I would say when it comes to, and I think where the question is coming from is dealing with the satanic and the demonic. There's always in the elements of temptation from a theological perspective, even when the accusation is horrific, there seems to always be an element of truth in what the powers of darkness accuse us of. And so there's an essential element of having to own the truth, even if it's a false accusation. Guilt can be false guilt or true guilt, but either way, you've got to respond to it the same way. So I would say that from a theological perspective, even when you're dealing with a direct or a veiled accusation from the powers of darkness, you want to make sure you're paying attention to what they're accusing you of.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Would that gel, Dr. Bud?
Yes, it would. I agree with that thoroughly.
Okay.
Dr. Dale? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. There's another question.
I got two here, and then Dr. Dale, I'll turn it over to you. Mara asked, can you talk about how the Holy Spirit mingles with us when we are asking these questions to ourselves?
I'm not sure I can talk about how it does, but but I can say that I'm sure it does if we're open to it. And that's the key to my mind, is to be open to it and not to try to control everything with my ego.
So good.
Brilliant. Okay, Mark Arstead asked, regarding the comment in The Last Temptation of Christ, it seems like the American gospel has been promising to deliver those middle-class values. How can we displace that compelling myth for our congregants who equate it with the gospel?
You have a very hard job, and you have my sympathy, because I think churches are caught in a double bind I wonder if they really begin to share what it means to live in the love of Christ and the love of God. How many people are going to keep coming to their church in our consumer society? But there are churches that are successful at it. And I think that that's a challenge that pastors face, and that if I were a pastor, I would spend a lot of time and reflection and prayer over. I don't think there's an easy answer to it.
Yeah.
Dr. Coulter, are you ready?
Yeah, so this has been great, Bud. I really appreciate all the insights. What I thought I would do is sort of describe how I understand the Christian mystical tradition, which I've studied quite a bit. And then you can maybe interface with that a little bit in light of what you've been saying as a way of bringing these two worlds together. So, of course, with Augustine, you have to go in to go up. In other words, you can't understand yourself, or you can't understand God apart from the self, and the self apart from God. So you go from the outer world to the inner world of the self, and then to the world of the divine, up. So it's always out, in, up. And within that context, then the imagination looms large. And the way in which the medievals think about this is the imagination has to be formed. And so there's a constant dialogue, not only with yourself, but with God, because that dialogue with God is the forming and shaping of your imagination. But the dialogue with God never occurs outside of the community context of the church. So to go back to what you said about the role of myth, this is the whole purpose of the church calendar. It's to slowly immerse us into a story, a universal story about the world and about us as we move through the feasts from Nativity or Christmas all the way through Pentecost. Every year we are reliving the story, and that story is forming and shaping our imagination, which is forming new beliefs, which kind of goes to a question that Lisa had asked about how we have to bring these new beliefs to bear on false beliefs that we have developed in and through our own childhood. What God says about who we are, that we are somebody in his image, redeemed, set free, those sorts of things. So there's a sense in which on the medieval and the early view, the imagination is both actively assessing the self, while at the same time being actively formed in a conversation with God, so that you're bringing these new beliefs to bear on your identity and false beliefs that you've held about who you are, and that you're, those sorts of things. So that's where the myth, the story of God, forms the imagination that is then brought to bear on the self. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's the way I'm thinking about it. And you can comment or think about how that Jungian approach interfaces with that. I think there are a lot of connections, but I would like to hear you talk about that.
Well, I agree with you totally. What you're saying makes perfect sense to me. And where I find sorrow is that what you say about the church year, and we live within that story, is, I think, very powerful. But I don't know of many churches that really teach us that. They all do it, but I think most of the people in it don't know what they're doing. It's the same thing. My wife and I like to say the rosary every evening because that is reuniting us with the story. I think it's very important. And I think all of those uh, dramatic stories and symbols and images are inherent in the religion, but we have lost one personal touch with the meaning of too many of them.
Yeah,
What
so I would
what
just,
awakened me to change my whole view on religion was reading Dr. Yun's interpretation of the deep archetypal symbolism in the math, and to realizing that that's inherent in my nature, and that all of us have it's built in to be religious, and it's built in to be spiritual, and we're either going to find it in a way to live it spiritually and as religion, or we're going to project it on something else. We're going to make religion out of golf or whatever. And we're not, the churches that I generally see are not connecting people back to that depths in that story. That really is an inborn part of our nature to develop.
Profound.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, and in the early and medieval periods, they have what the French medieval scholar Marie Dominique Chenu said that he called it the symbolist mentality. We have to see creation as symbolic and ourselves as symbolic, and these symbols, everything then has symbolic potential as a window opening up who God is and a window opening up who we are. And I think that's kind of what you've been talking about. But we have to, within that, the danger is that we misread it all. And so this is the whole point of the story of God. If we're formed and shaped by the story, if the church is doing what it's supposed to be doing, as you said, it's not always doing that. And incidentally, I'll just say this one thing. Unfortunately, Pentecostals and charismatics, we are so caught up in the spontaneity of the Spirit that we sometimes forget that preaching consistently over time the deep story of God is what forms and shapes people in the Spirit of God, whereby they can bring that then to bear as discernment on these symbols and start to understand and interpret them rightly. But we want our sermons to be more spontaneous, more in the moment. And what that can do, if we're not careful, is it leads to this buckshot approach to Christianity, where you're just hitting this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, and nobody ever gets a clear picture of, oh, here's the story, here's what it's all about, here's how I fit in the story. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And Jung was very clear in the individuation process that we have to learn how to live the symbolic life, because it is always the symbolic that connects us to the things beyond ourselves.
Profound, really profound. Pastor Misty?
Okay, Janet asked, she said, I have a child who has processing issues. How do you help someone to begin to process? Examples, once something is over, he moves on like it never happened, never reflects, even when there are great consequences involved.
It's a very dramatic question. How old is the child? Can I ask?
Yes, Janet, can you let us know how old your son is? "23, but now, Janet, I'm going to ask if this is that you have gotten this from a doctor or if this is opinion. She says he's 23, but the mind is like a 14-year-old. I'm wondering if that is an official something that she has heard from a doctor.
Yeah, or if it's just typical of 23-year-olds these
Yeah.
days.
So if you can let us know that, then we can make sure Dr. Harris knows that information as well. And not to be funny, but it can feel like they're thinking like young teenagers at that age, or sometimes there is very much a, okay, that's her opinion. And it's also, it's ADHD and possibly autistic. So I am gathering that there's not an official diagnosis here.
Yeah, doesn't seem like it.
Well, there are two parts of that that I think are very important. The first is that you have to be very sure that he doesn't need professional help in a case like that.
What would the other part be, Doc?
We're failing our adolescents. We're not showing them a road into adulthood anymore. We're not showing them a road into identity anymore. There's a huge amount of identity confusion, and that is because the culture has lost the models for what it really means to be an adult.
Wow.
When I was growing up, there was a myth, even though it wasn't a very good one, for being an adult. You grew up, you got married, you got a job, you had a family. There is no such guiding story for growing up anymore. And the story focuses on materialism and money, or it focuses on being a victim and disenchanted. And we are failing the youth in our world.
So we're talking about rites of passage being recovered.
we're no, we're talking about the fact that adults are not living in a way that show people growing into adulthood what it means to be an adult, why they should be an adult, what adults really should do in terms of finding purpose and meaning in their life.
So that wouldn't be tied to rites of passage. How do I know when I become an adult? What are the criteria by which I get integrated into adulthood?
It has to do with the story of being an adult. In the past, it had to do with rites of passage, but we're not going to be able uh, to put rites of passage in place if there's nowhere to passage to that makes sense.
So how do we remedy that?
That's a question that we're all facing and that pastors are facing more than anyone in many ways. How do we re-mythologize our culture to be a culture that values humanity, purpose, and meaning in the future, rather than materialism or consumerism or money or whatever, or fame. Fame is the other big thing that's
Yeah.
overvalued now.
So Dr. Budd, given all you understand about the unconscious and the collective unconscious, do you foresee an optimistic turning at some point? Does all of this stuff play itself out and exhaust us until we're open, or is there more of a pessimistic view of how this is going to unfold?
I wouldn't say it's pessimistic. I wrote a book not too long ago called Facing the Apocalypse, and how we need to meet the present and how we need to listen to Dr. Jung's admonition that where love stops, power begins, and violence and terror. And we need to learn how to re-mythologize the values of the heart into our lives and into our culture. And that is a challenge to us. If we can meet the challenge, I can be optimistic. If we don't meet the challenge, we're going to be in bad shape.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that I'm not doing everything I can to meet the challenge.
Right. Right. Pastor Misty?
Okay, our next question is, I would like to ask how an adult who had a broken and dysfunctional upbringing from childhood can begin to face the past world, world, through it and develop healthy, positive self-esteem, worthwhile learning to develop healthy relationships without putting a Band-Aid on the hurt.
You may have to put a Band-Aid on the hurt to get started and build up the strength to later go into the hurt and work one's way through it. And I think that we have to understand that we can't do it all ourselves. We need help. We need community. We need pastors. We need support of churches. We need to be able to reach out and get the help that we need that will give us the strength to face what we need to face within ourselves, but also to realize that we're not alone. There are many people in the same category and that we can help each other.
Our next question is, within my own life and having mother and father issues that were not fully addressed, I feel I have carried it over into my adulthood, and that has not helped my own children. So I don't know that that's really a question, a statement.
Well, I will respond to it anyway,
Yes,
if
please
that's okay.
do. Yes.
There are things out there that can help us, and I, books have helped me all my life. That's why I write them. And my wife and I wrote a book on the feminine, and that is really about healing the mother wound And I wrote a book on the father quest. That's about healing the father wound. And look for books that speak to you. Look for books that help you psychologically and spiritually. And then look around for other people that you can share with or talk to about them.
And are your books available on Amazon or your website directly?
They're
Or
available on Amazon. Yes, you just look under Bud Harris.
okay,
And if you look under Bud Harris on YouTube, you can see a few lectures and talks that my wife and I give.
wonderful.
She gives a talk on YouTube, Into the Heart of the Feminine, that's really dynamite, I think.
Okay, awesome.
Dr. Bud, there is a question in the chat room that I think I'll preface. If I'm probably going to misquote Jung, but he talked about how ego has its own psychology for each of us, something to that effect. But that if from that he begins to develop the temperaments, and he wrote the book on the temperaments, which Myers-Briggs took and did the whole Myers-Briggs analysis. So the person that's asking is an introvert, and I guess asking from perspective of being an introvert. How does all this work in my life? So given Jung's work on the ego and consciousness and the four basic, all the dynamics of the temperament styles, when you put them all in various combinations, particularize that for her.
Well, I'm an introvert too. So my whole journey has been the journey of an introvert. Jung was an introvert. Most Jungians are introverts. I had one extrovert at the Institute when I was there, and we consider her our token extrovert. Again, the challenge for us there is to look at if I'm an introvert, then I need to develop my capacity in extroversion. If I'm a feeling type, I need to develop my thinking capacity as well. We need not to get stuck, as Myers-Briggs tends to do, in one definition. And Jung went beyond typology because he thought that we get too bogged down thinking typology will answer questions or define our problems when we really need to look at other things. When I was an introvert, all of my life, still am. And when Ani Eliyafi, who was Jung's secretary and the co-author of his autobiography with him, spoke to me in Zurich, she told me I had to go back to the States and teach. And I was horrified. That's the last thing I wanted to do, was get up and speak to crowds, because I was an introvert. And so I just went into denial about that for about 10 years, till finally I ended up having to face it, and then having to do it, and having to learn how to do it. So it's a challenge to develop the other side of our typology. And we also have to understand that in getting in touch with our shadow is exactly where the other side of our typology is. So my extroversion was in my shadow, and in confronting my shadow, I had to confront my capacity to be extroverted when it was appropriate.
Wow. So, Dr. Bud, would you say that personality then is not static?
Of course, it's not static. No, it shouldn't be static.
So that who I am today could be profoundly different than who I was 30 years ago.
Absolutely. And it makes me look forward to who I'm going to be.
So when
Dr. Jung said we should approach aging as if we're going to live for 400 years. So that means that I'm always in anticipation of who I am becoming.
Okay, so let me ask you, because you had mentioned that when we talked privately. So I'm just curious, your reflections on that statement, when Dr. Jung says that we should approach life as if we're going to live 400 years, would you venture a guess on how that might impact longevity?
I think it will impact longevity tremendously. I think it makes us vital, and the more vital we are, the longer we will live. And the more we have purpose and meaning that we're pursuing, I think the longer that we will live, or if our life is cut short, the more fully we will have lived.
So that in some sense, we're talking about something that actually transcends genetics then as well.
Yes.
Wow.
I think the human spirit transcends genetics.
Wow. Because then that opens up a whole new vista of possibilities for talking about the potential for wholeness.
Yes.
If we're willing to work through our sufferings. Let me
Or
ask.
find wholeness in our suffering.
Yeah.
My daughter is finding wholeness in her
Right.
suffering.
Right. So let me ask you two more questions and then we'll let you go if that's okay.
Okay.
Or actually it's one question and probably two parts. We've talked about imagination. What role does the intuitive aspect of the psyche play in all of this? Having, I'm again profoundly impacted by Jung's writings, but most deeply probably by the fact that when he writes the autobiography, he's 83 years old, he's reflecting back with all of that wisdom of the years. And he does talk about the intuitive for him. And ironically, Dr. Budd, as I think about many of the theological presuppositions that I hold, he didn't go about discovery from a theological perspective, though he wrestled with his faith, but he intuited them psychologically. Talk a little bit about the function of intuition within the grand scheme of a Jungian approach to the conscious and the unconscious.
I think the importance of intuition is that it can give us vision. Now, we must have the ground that supports vision. We must have the thinking and the feeling that questions vision, but intuition gives us vision.
Wow.
And if you look at its opposite, sensing and the Myers-Briggs stuff, sensing shows us what's concrete. Intuition gives us vision. We need both.
Can it be cultivated?
I think as we cultivate our entire journey into wholeness, we will be cultivating that as well. I don't think it should be tried. I don't think we should try to cultivate it separately. I think it needs to be cultivated as part of the whole journey.
Yeah, so you don't segment it out. You have to see it as part of the journey towards wholeness.
Yes, yes.
Again, you're looking at everything holistically, which is really important, very profound.
Yes.
Which raises for me the question of, I wonder how often, maybe Dr. Dale can weigh in on this, how often we may accidentally or intentionally, Dr. Dale, if you want to weigh in on this, how in theological work we can end up unintentionally or intentionally, if we look at some of the hyper reform guys, segment out aspects of the wholeness of salvation and end up fragmenting what should be seen in a holistic way. You want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I mean, I think this goes back to something Bud said a few moments ago. Well, about 30 minutes ago, maybe now. If we reduce things to baptism, so there is a sense in certain versions of Christianity, versions of Protestantism more particularly,
Yes.
which reduce conversion to an upfront prayer faith, basically to regeneration or being born again, and then that's it. Then you're in, and it's as though there's a divine download of everything in that moment, in this And so, and they don't talk about the psychology of conversion so much as they talk about the particular theological sequence that unfolds. Faith, then regeneration, or regeneration, then faith, and they get into those sort of debates. It's called an ordo salutis, an order of salvation, right? But to even think of it that way is, again, to think of salvation as reducible to what happens up front, when, as what Bud says a few moments ago, that's the entrance to a journey of transformation that requires our participation. And it's in the journey that we are made whole over the course of our lives as we cooperate with God in the Spirit. We're shaped by the story of God, and we move into this fellowship with God in the middle of the people of God. So, I mean, I think to think of salvation in a more reductionistic way, by reducing it to what happens up front in the Christian life, is to kind of cut yourself off. And then you sort of get into this, especially when it's accompanied with what I'd call worm theology, where, I'm always under the judgment of God, and I'm always a heinous sinner, and I'm always, that sort of thing, which some versions of justification lend themselves to. Well, now you're in this cycle where I remember one preacher saying, well, I always identify with Peter because, I'm never actually getting beyond anything. I'm always failing. I'm always struggling. Well, this guy, it ended up that when he was saying that, he was involved in an adulterous relationship with the wife of a staff member. And so you're thinking, well, okay. But it's this sense where we're not growing because we've reduced salvation to what happens up front, is what I would say. And we've got to think about this as a way of faith, a way of salvation, a journey, a process, that sort of thing. That's the way I would want to kind of talk about a more holistic way. And it's a journey toward wholeness. So it's a journey of reintegrating the self, which has been disintegrated. That's the way Athanasius wants us to think about sin. It's the disintegration of the self. So we've got to reintegrate through this journey.
Powerful. Dr. Bud, closing comments, insights that you want to share?
Thank you for what you just said. I couldn't agree with that more. I've enjoyed talking with you. I have enjoyed the questions. It's made me think, and I always come into these things a little bit excited because I wonder what they're going to help me have to learn myself as I go through. And this has been very rewarding for me. So thank you all very much.
Well, Dr. Bud, I hope this won't be the last time.
I hope so too.
Yeah, we would love to have you back. It's been very rich. We're deeply grateful for your investment and for the life you've lived. We're gleaning from your life, and
Thank you.
It's been a tremendous gift. And so, thank you so much. Pastor Misty, you want to fill us in on what's happening this afternoon, and then give everybody a break to go and eat and relax?
Yes, so thank you all. And there's many thank yous in the chat to you, sir, to Dr. Harris and Bishop and Dr. Dale as well. So thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone. We are going to break now. We will resume at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Dr. David Rico will be on with us then. It's going to be another very, very powerful session. So have some lunch. We will reconvene at 2, and then we will reconvene for our evening session at 7 p.m. tonight. So have a great little break here. Get yourself some lunch or breakfast wherever you are. If Hadassah's on, she's having dinner. But we look forward to seeing you all in a little bit. So have a great day. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.